Story 1. There's a stretch of woods just outside the town I grew up in. The kind of place where old trails snake off in every direction and you can walk for hours without seeing another soul. When I was younger, those forests were where I'd spend my weekends with friends fishing, camping, hiking, but after I moved away, I hadn't been back in years to summers ago. I decided to visit my hometown for a week. Nostalgia got the better of me, and I thought it would be fun to relive some of those childhood adventures. I didn't want to make it a big production, so I threw together the basics: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and just enough food to get by. No fancy gear, no plan, just me, the trees, and a night or two under the stars. I started down a trail I barely remembered, expecting it to lead me to the small pond I knew was hidden a few miles deep. But after an hour of walking, it became clear this wasn't the same path. The further I went, the more unfamiliar everything looked. No pond, no landmarks. Just a twisting trail that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. At first, I didn't mind. Something about not knowing where I was headed made the trip feel more like an adventure. But by the third hour, my legs were aching, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I hadn't passed another hiker, hadn't seen a single signpost, just an old, narrow trail cutting deeper into silence. I finally gave in and chose a small clearing a few feet off the path. It wasn't much, just a patch of relatively flat ground. But I didn't care. My priority was beating the sunset. I set up my little tent, gathered what dry branches I could find, and managed to coax a fire to life just as the forest dropped into shadow. The glow of the flames pushed the darkness back a few yards, but it wasn't enough to make me feel safe venturing far. I boiled some water, made a weak cup of tea, and sat listening to the forest. There's a stillness in those woods that makes you aware of every sound: the hiss of the fire, the pop of burning bark, the distant rustle of leaves. I'd been sitting there for maybe an hour when I heard footsteps on the trail. At first, I froze, assuming it was an animal. The crunch of leaves was steady, deliberate, human. My fire cast enough light that I could see movement: a tall figure with a large backpack. They didn't stop, didn't look at me, didn't even have a flashlight. They just walked past, swallowed by the dark on the other side of the clearing. Something about that unsettled me. Who hikes that deep into the forest after nightfall without a light? Who doesn't even glance at another person sitting beside a fire? I told myself they were just an experienced backpacker, someone more comfortable in the woods than I was. Still, the image of that tall, silent figure stuck with me. I stayed awake by the fire for another hour before letting it die down. Crawling into the tent, I zipped it shut and tried to sleep. I woke in the middle of the night with a full bladder. I lay there for a long time, trying to ignore it, but eventually I gave in, grumbling. I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold night. The fire was nothing but glowing embers now. I walked maybe 30 feet into the trees and relieved myself, but as I turned back, movement caught my eye. Something shifted on the far side of my campsite. The moon was out, but the light barely touched the trees. I couldn't make out details, but my gut twisted immediately. I knew it was a person. I walked slowly toward the tent, scanning the tree line. My hand shook as I dug into my bag, pulling out my flashlight. When I flicked it on, the beam cut through the dark and landed on a man. He was standing on the trail, half hidden by the trees, tall, still, watching. The moment the light hit him, he bolted, disappearing behind the tree trunks faster than I could react. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my grip, every nerve screaming at me to run. After a full minute, I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay. I stuffed my sleeping bag and gear into my pack, leaving. The tent behind. The trail stretched out before me, empty and endless, with the flashlight beam sweeping side to side. I started walking. Every sound set me on edge. The crunch of my own boots. The whisper of wind through the branches. Every so often I thought I heard something else, a twig snapping. The faint echo of footsteps, but when I swung the light round, there was nothing. Halfway back, the eastern sky began to glow. The sun was rising. Relief flooded me, though I never let myself stop moving until the trees thinned and the familiar sight of the trailhead came into view. I made it home, shaken but unharmed. The first thing I did was look up the trail on an old map of the forest. That's when I realized it wasn't an official trail at all. No markings, no record. Just a faded footpath that shouldn't have been there. Maybe that stranger was just another wanderer like me, someone who'd found their way onto the same forgotten path. But if that was true, why had they returned in the middle of the night? Why had they stood there, silently watching my camp? The more I think about it, the more I believe that night was supposed to end differently. Maybe the only reason I made it back was because I left when I did dot, and sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can't shake the thought that whoever or whatever that was might still be walking that hidden trail, waiting for someone else to follow it into the dark. Story 2. I grew up in a household that most people would call strict, but in reality, it was something far stranger. My parents were Southern Baptists, the kind who didn't believe in ghosts but were absolutely convinced that demons were real. Not metaphorical demons, not psychological ones. They believed in the literal biblical kind. Anything unsettling, anything inexplicable, wasn't the work of a restless spirit. It was something darker, something predatory, ancient. They drilled it into me from a young age. The kind of thing that seeps into your bones. To reject the possibility of demons was to reject Scripture itself. My mother, though, was different. Faith was optional for her. She wasn't dismissive. She wasn't bitter. She was indifferent in a way that unnerved me even as a child. She'd say things like, "God and I have an understanding," and shrug. Where my father leaned heavily into religion as a framework to control our lives, my mother drifted further away. That divide created a silent tension, one I didn't understand at the time. My mother was also deeply unstable. Some days she was perfectly functional, capable of holding down a conversation, cooking a meal, even being loving. Other days she seemed untethered from reality. Looking back now, I can say with certainty she struggled with schizophrenia or a similar mental disorder. But in those days, people didn't talk about it. There weren't therapy sessions. There weren't diagnoses. There was just her. I remember one afternoon vividly, I had a nightmare. One so precise and vivid that the details are etched into my memory even now. I was lying in my bed when my mother burst into my room, screaming in a rage I couldn't comprehend. She grabbed my wrist, shaking me violently, her face twisted in anger that didn't belong to her usual self. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering. But the moment I tried to calm myself, it happened again. The door banged open, and there she was, exactly as she had been in my dream. Same expression, same rage, same words that didn't quite make sense in my ears. I pushed her off, screaming, terrified. And just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. In the morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. Confused, almost hurt that I seemed upset. She had no memory of barging in, no recollection of the violent episode. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, a bizarre overlap between my subconscious and her erratic moods. But some part of me, a deep part that I didn't understand, wondered if it was something darker. Weeks later, something happened that still chills me when I think about it. I heard her screaming from the backyard, not a panicked scream, not a cry of fear, but something almost gleeful. I rushed outside and froze. She was holding a massive snake, its body long and thick, slithering between her hands like it weighed nothing at all, and yet my mother had always had an irrational, almost pathological fear of snakes. Even seeing one on television would send her stumbling backward, terrified, and here she was, gripping it like a toy, grinning at me, eyes wide, and unblinking. "Come here," she said, motioning for me to take it. I shook my head, stepping back, heart pounding. "Mom, what the hell?" But she didn't respond, didn't seem to understand me at all. She just smiled wider, tilting her head, a deliberate, predatory motion. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me, but I watched through the window as she let the snake slide to the ground and walked back into the house, as if nothing had happened. Later, when I asked her about it, she shrugged. "You must have dreamed it," she said, refusing to entertain the memory. That winter, my church hosted an overnight lock-in for the youth group. I looked forward to it as an escape, a night in, a structured, predictable environment. My mother dropped me off completely sober, kissed my forehead, and left me at the church. Hours later, just as everyone was settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. It wasn't a typical knock. It moved, traveling round the building in impossible ways. Sometimes it sounded like it came from multiple directions. At once, it was rhythmic, deliberate, and far too loud to be wind or a stray branch. I ran to wake the pastor. As soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and froze. Standing there, barefoot in the freezing night, was my mother. Her hair was soaked with sweat, her clothes disheveled, lips moving silently, her eyes locked on mine, wide and unblinking, and a slow, sinister smile spread across her face. She walked toward me with an unnerving calm. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I felt powerless, drawn to her as if some invisible force compelled me to follow. The pastor tried to intervene, whispering for me to stay. But I couldn't. I got into the car with her. She didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't answer a single question. The drive home was silent. The kind of silence that presses on your chest. When we arrived, she merely stood in the doorway, watching me walk to my room. I locked the door behind me and lay awake for hours, hard hammering, listening for any sound. The next morning, she was perfectly normal, cheerful, cooking breakfast, acting as if the previous night had never occurred. When I asked her about the church, she said she had been about to pick me up, oblivious to everything. No one else mentioned it either, not the pastor, not the elders. It was like they hadn't noticed. Or perhaps they didn't know how to explain it. Years later, my mother passed away, but the memories linger, the unpredictability. The moments where reality and something else seem to overlap, logical explanations exist. Of course, mental illness, addiction, stress, but some nights, when the world is quiet, I remember the way she smiled at me with empty, unknowing eyes. And I wonder if the explanations are enough. I don't know if I believe in demons anymore, if I believe in the supernatural, or if the truth lies somewhere in between. But the memory of her of those nights, where the boundary between reality and nightmare collapsed, is something that will never leave me, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock, traveling impossibly through the house, and I remember that some things in this world are darker than reason allows. Story 3. My eldest son, George, started sleepwalking when he was about 4 or 5. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids go through phases, right? It was just one of those unsettling quirks, something I could live with. But the more it happened, the more strange it became. Most nights, I'd wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom. He didn't shuffle or stumble. He stood almost perfectly still, shifting slightly on his heels, swaying just enough to seem alive but not fully present. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing me, not really. It was as if he were peering past me into a place I could never reach. Sometimes he murmured words, slurred and soft, incomprehensible. Other nights, he just stood there, breathing slowly, deliberately, as if measuring time itself with each inhale and exhale. I'd gently guide him back to bed, whispering reassurances, trying not to wake him fully. And, like clockwork, the next morning, he would have no memory of any of it. For months, it was manageable. I chalked it up to a harmless phase. Then one night, things escalated. I woke to a rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it was water, dripping somewhere in on a window or a leaky faucet. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady, not random, not erratic. It was slow, deliberate, almost like a heartbeat made audible. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I got out of bed and followed the sound. There he was, George, forehead pressed lightly against the wall, tapping in precise, measured rhythm. His fingers grazed the surface in sync with his head, as if trying to push through something invisible. I whispered his name. Nothing. I touched his shoulder. Still nothing. He remained locked in that trance, swaying slightly, swaying into the empty air, as though testing the boundary between worlds. I finally guided him back to bed. He blinked, confused, then slept as though nothing had happened. I told myself it was a phase, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the image. George standing there, tapping at the wall as if he knew something ID in single quotes T.years later. My younger son, Michael, began sleepwalking at first. I didn't think much of it. Kids repeat patterns, right? But the unease returned almost immediately. Michael's sleepwalking mirrored George's in every way, standing in the hallway, eyes open but empty, swaying slightly, murmuring under his breath. And then, one night, the tapping began. I froze. The sound was identical to George's. My blood ran cold. Michael's forehead pressed against the exact same spot on the wall. His small fingers brushed along the surface, the uncanny precision of it. The repetition across to children was impossible to rationalize. Michael had never seen George sleepwalk, at least not in this way. There was no reason for him to replicate it, and yet he did. I snapped him out of it, guided him back to bed, and reassured myself. Children do strange things. Maybe it was subconscious, instinctual, genetic, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Years passed. Both boys grew, went to college, and the house became quiet. My husband and I decided to do some minor renovations, fresh paint, new floors, peeling back old wallpaper. That's when we found it, an antique-style mirror, hidden behind decades of wallpaper. Its frame was ornate, the glass slightly warped. With each, I froze. It was positioned exactly where both of my sons had pressed their foreheads against the wall all those years ago, the spot they had tried to walk into, eyes wide open, bodies swaying, somehow, unconsciously. They had been drawn to it. They hadn't known it was there. They had never seen it, and yet, instinctively, they had attempted to step through it. I had it removed immediately, but I am still haunted by it. I replay the image in my mind, to children, separated by years, both drawn to an invisible portal, compelled to interact with something beyond comprehension. I tried to rationalize its sleepwalking quirks, subconscious instincts, echoes of family behavior, but none of it explains the mirror. Some nights, I still hear the faint tapping in my dreams. I see empty eyes, small bodies swaying gently, pressing against a surface that shouldn't exist, and sometimes I wonder, what had they really seen? And if it wasn't the mirror itself, what else might be in this house, waiting to be discovered? Even now, after years, I can't shake the memory. I tell myself there's a rational explanation. But the logical side of my brain feels hollow when I recall the precise, obsessive rhythm. The vacant gazes, the way two separate children were drawn to the same spot without knowing why. Some things in this world, I've realized, might never be explained. Some mysteries remain just beyond our reach, tapping gently, slowly, at the edges of our perception, and I know if I ever look too closely, I might see it again. Story 3. My eldest son, George, started sleepwalking when he was about 4 or 5. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids go through phases, right? It was just one of those unsettling quirks, something I could live with. But the more it happened, the more strange it became. Most nights, I'd wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom. He didn't shuffle or stumble. He stood almost perfectly still, shifting slightly on his heels, swaying just enough to seem alive but not fully present. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing me, not really. It was as if he were peering past me into a place I could never reach. Sometimes he murmured words